A Navy corpsman had a seat on the last truck leaving Udamni. He never took it. This is the Chosin Reservoir, November 1950. What happened between the mortar barrage and the moment that truck pulled away, that is what no citation was ever written to explain. Late November 1950. Hospital corpsman 3rd Class Everett Boyle sat in a frozen fighting hole above Udamni. His aid bag zipped inside his jacket so the plasma wouldn't freeze. 9 weeks in Korea. He had not lost a man he reached in time. That was about to change. The temperature that week fell past -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Some nights past -30. Rifle oil turned to paste. Radios died in the cold before their batteries did. Boyle had learned the way every corpsman in the 1st Marine Division learned that winter, that the enemy wasn't only the men across the valley, it was the ground, the air, the metal in his own hands. He carried 2 morphine syrettes against his skin, under his shirt. A frozen syrette was just a piece of glass. Command in Tokyo believed the war was close to over. The intelligence reaching the regiments said the same. See, what the regiments around the reservoir were actually seeing: fires on distant ridgelines, tracks in fresh snow that didn't belong to any unit on the map, didn't match. Boyle didn't have a word for what was forming around him in the dark. Nobody at his level was told the number. 9 Chinese divisions, closing on a Marine division that still thought it was advancing toward the Yalu. At 2,200 on the 27th, the first mortar round landed 2 ridgelines over. Boyle counted the interval before the second, a habit, not training. 14 seconds. Then a voice from the next hole, flat and urgent. Doc. He was already moving before he answered. What Boyle found in the next 4 hours would put him in a position no manual had a name for, and would decide 3 days later who got a seat on the only truck heading south. By 1950, the Army and Navy medical services had rebuilt the evacuation chain that would go on to cut the Korean War's fatality rate for the seriously wounded nearly in half compared to World War II. The doctrine had a name for every stage: point of injury, to battalion collecting station, to division clearing station, to a mobile Army surgical hospital, the MASH, where a wound that killed in 1944 usually didn't in 1950. None of that chain reached Udamni that week. There was one road out, a single unpaved main supply route running 78 miles down to the port at Hungnam, and no helicopter could operate at this altitude, in this cold, over ground, this exposed. So what did the doctrine actually give a corpsman standing on that ridge? A tagging system to sort casualties by severity. A morphine dose calibrated for a body at normal temperature, not one already losing heat faster than it could make it. And an assumption, written by someone in a warm office, that a wounded man could be kept alive for the 2 to 4 hours a truck would need to reach him. What that assumption didn't account for is the one number that mattered most in Boyle's aid bag that week, and it wasn't in any training manual. The plasma bottles hanging from a Jeep antenna froze solid within 20 minutes. The morphine syrettes froze faster. Corpsmen up and down the line had already started doing something the manual never mentioned: carrying the syrettes against their own bodies, thawing a dose the way you'd thaw a coin you meant to use in a payphone. It wasn't elegant. It worked. Battalion Surgeon Lieutenant Commander Frank Halloran, running the aid station at the base of the ridge since the division moved north, had stopped correcting corpsmen who did this. He'd started teaching it. What the doctrine required was clear. What it left entirely to Halloran's judgment, and to men like Boyle, who'd never worn his rank, was almost everything that actually decided who lived. Halloran had been a battalion surgeon for one war already, the Pacific, 5 years earlier. And what he'd learned there was the lesson every experienced field doctor eventually learns, and none of them can fully write down. The manual tells you how to treat a wound. It doesn't tell you how to choose between 2 wounded men when you only have transport for one. By the time the division reached the reservoir, Halloran had developed something like an instinct for it, not written into any casualty sorting protocol, not taught in any Navy Medical Corps course. He could look at a man's face, listen to the rhythm of his breathing, and make a call a textbook triage tag couldn't. This one survives the ride. Get him on the truck. This one won't survive being moved tonight, not in this cold. Keep him warm, keep him talking, and pray the line holds long enough for a mash bed to open up closer than it currently was. He never told his corpsman the second half of that judgment out loud. He didn't have to. Boyle and the others learned to read it in how long Halloran lingered at a stretcher before moving to the next one. What Halloran hadn't yet worked out, what nobody at Udemy had worked out, because nobody had needed to yet, was what happened when the number of men who couldn't survive the ride outnumbered the trucks willing to wait for them. That math was still 3 days away. Halloran didn't know it was coming for one specific corpsman under his command, on one specific night, with 6 wounded men on an exposed ridge and no cover at all. The barrage came just after 0200 on the 29th. Not the probing fire of the 27th, but a sustained mortar concentration walking across the ridge where 2 rifle squads were dug in. 6 men went down in the first 90 seconds, 3 of them badly. Boyle was 30 yards away. He covered the distance on his stomach standing, meant becoming the next round's target, and reached the first man, a gut wound. The kind that killed slowly if you didn't stop the bleeding fast, and killed almost as fast if you moved him wrong. He packed it. He moved to the second man. A fragment caught his own face, and he didn't register it for almost an hour, warm blood freezing against his cheek before he'd finished with the third casualty. There was no cover on that ridge. There wasn't going to be any. Boyle worked in near total dark, in temperatures that had by then dropped past -25, doing something the manual assumed would happen in a lit, heated collecting station, sorting 6 men by who could wait and who couldn't, thawing a morphine syringe against the inside of his cheek before he could use it, packing a wound with fingers that had stopped fully obeying him somewhere around the second casualty. A second fragment caught him in the arm, working on the 5th man. He kept working. By first light, all 6 were still alive. Boyle had refused aid for both of his own wounds twice, once when a runner said a corpsman from the aid station was coming up, and once when Halloran himself, arriving at dawn to help move the wounded down, told him to sit down and let someone look at his arm. Boyle didn't sit down. He asked Halloran a different question instead. How many trucks were coming, and how many of the 6 men on that ridge were going to fit? Everything up to this point is the version of that night that made it into casualty reports and unit logs. What happened when the trucks actually arrived did not. 3 deuce-and-a-half trucks came up the MSR from Hagaruri a little after 0900, sent forward to carry the worst of the wounded down the mountain before the road closed again. And it closed often, because a single disabled vehicle anywhere on that one-lane track could stop the entire column. And the Chinese knew it. The trucks had room, by Halloran's count, for 11 litter cases. There were 14 men on that ridge who couldn't walk out on their own. Boyle, bleeding from 2 wounds he still hadn't let anyone treat, was, technically, one of the 14. Halloran told him to get on the second truck. He didn't get on the second truck. 3 of the men he'd worked on through the night had started running fevers that told him, more clearly than any tag, that they wouldn't survive a jolting 7-hour ride, wedged upright between other stretchers in that cold. Somebody needed to keep pressure on a dressing that wouldn't hold itself, get water into a man who could no longer ask for it, and watch 3 separate sets of vital signs at once until the next relief column, or the next available bed at Hagaruri, whichever came first. That job wasn't written on any casualty tag. It also wasn't going to get done by anyone riding in that truck. Boyle told the driver to go. He gave his place to a 19-year-old with a gut wound who was, by the numbers, in worse shape to survive the wait than Boyle was to survive the ride. Halloran watched the last truck pull out onto the MSR and disappear around the first switchback. and understood the way he'd understood it twice before in the Pacific, and never once found a way to write into a report exactly what he was looking at, and exactly what it was going to cost. Every unit that fought at Chosin filed an after-action report once it reached Hungnam, and the Navy Medical Corps reviewed corpsman conduct for citations the same way every service does against a form. The form asked what happened. It didn't ask what it felt like to make a triage call on an exposed ridge with your own blood freezing on your face. And it certainly didn't ask what it cost a battalion surgeon to watch a wounded corpsman give up his seat on the only truck heading south that morning. Halloran wrote the report anyway. Dates, casualty counts, actions taken, that part was easy. Then he reached the paragraph that was supposed to explain why Boyle had stayed, and found the form simply had no line for it. What he wrote instead was 3 sentences long. Every man who read it afterward understood there was a version of that morning the 3 sentences weren't built to hold. This is the gap this channel keeps returning to, because it never closes. The institutional record and the operational reality aren't the same document, and the space between them is where most of what actually happened lives. A citation can describe 6 wounded men treated under fire. It can't describe the decision to stay with 3 of them instead of riding to safety, not because the writer didn't understand it, but because the form was never designed to ask. Halloran's report went up the chain. Somewhere above him, someone decided whether 3 sentences were enough to recommend a decoration. What that officer never saw, because no form asked for it, was the specific arithmetic Boyle had done in his head in the 90 seconds before that truck pulled away. 11 seats, 14 men, and which 3 couldn't wait. The relief column that was supposed to reach that section of the ridge by mid-morning didn't arrive until after 1400, delayed by exactly the kind of choke point Halloran had been dreading, a burned-out truck blocking the MSR 2 miles south. Boyle held his position for 5 more hours, pressure on the dressing, water when he could get a man to swallow it, and the same running count of vital signs he'd started the night before. All 3 men made it off that ridge alive. What happened to each of them afterward? One recovering enough to return to his unit within weeks, the others facing a longer road through hospitals in Japan, and then stateside is the part period record-keeping traces only loosely. Wartime medical logs of this kind rarely followed a patient past the ward that treated him next. The larger movement, Boyle's Ridge, was a small piece of continued exactly the way Major General Oliver P. Smith had insisted it would, not a retreat, but a fighting withdrawal, unit by unit, down one road, Udamni to Hagaro-ri, Hagaro-ri to Koto-ri, Koto-ri to the coast. By December 11, what remained of the 1st Marine Division reached Hungnam and boarded ships. They brought their wounded. They brought their dead. They did not leave their equipment behind, which Smith had refused to do from the first day of the movement. Boyle went with them. Halloran's report went into a file. What that file never fully recorded, because no report is built to record it, is a specific morning on a specific ridge, and a corpsman who did the arithmetic on 11 seats and 14 men, and decided, without being ordered to, which 3 of those men he was staying for. The Frozen Chosen, the name the survivors gave themselves, and war afterward like a unit citation nobody had to issue, became one of the most studied campaigns in the history of American military medicine. Not because the doctrine worked perfectly, but because it didn't, and because corpsmen and battalion surgeons like Halloran improvised. In real time, the fixes the next edition of the manual would eventually catch up to better cold weather plasma handling, morphine carried against the body as standard practice instead of an improvisation, revised evacuation timelines that assumed a truck might take twice as long as the textbook said it should. None of that answers the question this video opened with. The manual gets rewritten, the specific morning doesn't. What decided who survived that ridge above Udamni wasn't the doctrine. It was a 20-year-old corpsman doing arithmetic nobody trained him to do in weather nobody had designed his equipment for, and a battalion surgeon who understood exactly what that arithmetic cost and never found a form that asked him to explain it. If this channel should keep pulling stories like this out of official records and unit histories nobody reads anymore, subscribe. There are more ridges, more overloaded trucks, more men who did the math nobody ordered them to do, and more decisions that never made it past 3 sentences in somebody's after-action report. You don't need a personal connection to Korea in 1950 for this one to matter. You only need to have ever had to choose who gets help first when there isn't enough to go around. If you have a connection to this era, the Marine Corps, the Navy Medical Corps, Korea, tell us below. Did anyone in your family serve at Chosin, or come home and never talk about that winter? And if you want to see what the next generation of cold weather medicine actually looked like once the Marine Corps rewrote its own manual after this winter, that's a video this channel still owes you. Halloran's after-action report on the ridge above Udamni was filed in December 1950 and closed without further comment. What it recorded: 6 casualties treated under fire, 3 held for delayed evacuation, all survived. What it did not record: 11 seats, 14 men, and the 90 seconds in which one corpsman decided which 3 he was staying for. Boyle received no citation for that morning. He never asked for one. The truck went south without him, and the line, somehow, held.